up, and that's where the government was at the time. And the next year, Elizabeth bought this island, which was on her front doorstep. So her father buys 300 acres on the Pennsylvania side as a plantation, buys the house that the Swedish seller lived in, and then bought this island. And we know she bought it primarily to grow hay and raise hogs. We know that from the deed. What we've now since learned, after finding unbelievably, we found it in the files of my Camden County Historical Society, we found a confirmation deed relating to this deed that was dated 20 years later and is signed by one of the persons whose mark appeared on this deed. In other words, the Lenape didn't sign their names, they would put their, I don't know what, kind of like a picture or meaning their name. And with the same mark, and on the confirmation deed of the Camden County Historical Society, the Englishman who wrote out the deed said that one of the signatures of Ojaragua said her mark. And we were astounded because up until this point in time,
Because they were men.
it had always been assumed that these are patriarchal societies and it's the men who are doing all the transactions. And here we have an unusual situation where a 21-year-old Quaker woman is engaging in the largest land transaction, in the Delaware Valley, with a Lenape woman who later on, 20 years later, is the only one who confirms that she bought that deed 20 years later. And one of the witnesses is a woman. So as you can say, this is the first big women's land real estate transaction that occurred in Delaware Valley. Well, why did they have to get a confirmation? Because the ownership of this island was in dispute for a long period of time. The New Jersey proprietors, these are the people who bought the land on the New Jersey side, and everybody got their title from King Charles II. He was one who gave William Penn, Pennsylvania. He was the one who gave New Jersey to his brother, who sold it to the other guy, who sold it to Edward Billings. Anyway, the New Jersey landowners always thought that they owned out to the middle of the river, and maybe even over to the Pennsylvania shore. And William Penn, after he lost interest in New Jersey, after King Charles gave him Pennsylvania, he thought his eastern boundary was the New Jersey shoreline, the high water mark. So he thought all the islands belonged to him. And so for the longest time, the Fairmans, who had bought this island from Lenape, couldn't get title from anybody because no one knew for sure who actually owned the island. And it wasn't until 1701 that William Penn finally gave Elizabeth's husband. She married Thomas Fairman, who was a surveyor who helped William Penn survey a lot of Philadelphia area, and a lot of Bucks County, Montgomery County, and turns out was owed a lot of money by William Penn, because Penn was one of these guys who was land rich and cash poor, and all of his colonial administrators had to figure out how to get paid by either graft or making land deals. He would ask Penn for land in exchange for their services. So Thomas Fairman, who married Elizabeth Kinsey, asked Penn to grant him a charter for this island as partial repayment for some of the surveying services that Thomas Fairman had done for Penn. And we know this because in the archives in the city of Philadelphia, I found a long bill that Thomas Fairman had sent to William Penn for all the services that he had done for the proprietor, including and not limited to boarding all of Penn's officials who would come before Philadelphia was established. They'd all come and stay at the house of the people who owned Petty's Island, Thomas Fairman and Elizabeth Kinsey, right at Treaty Park, just north of the Sugar House Casino. And when William Penn came, the first winter he stayed, asked the Fairmans to move out, he stayed in their house. That was the de facto capital of Pennsylvania. The house of people who owned Petty's Island was the the headquarters of William Penn, the first capital country before they built his house in Philadelphia. So all of you from Philadelphia is probably a greater historical attachment to this island than people from New Jersey.
You think the native people picked a woman because the other person was a woman?
We don't know.
Yeah, of course you don't. No, yeah.
We don't.
Never mind.
We don't.
Just a theory.
So, anybody know what happened to the Lenape?
They're in Oklahoma, aren't they?
West.
They're in Oklahoma. They're in Canada. There's some, one other place too. Anybody know why they left? And remember, they preserved the right to hunt and fish in a lot of these places.
I think they chose to, and they wrote a letter back years later saying, we were treated fairly by the Quakers here.
They really weren't. They were cheated and tricked and dispossessed of their land over time just by overwhelming numbers of people. And the successors to the early Quakers who did try to treat them fairly, and you make a good point, the early Quakers at least tried to buy the land or buy rights to the land from them. If you go to the other colonies, like down in Virginia, up in Massachusetts, remember growing up as kids, we learned all about how wonderful the relations were between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, and how Samoset came and showed them how to plant corn and fish and stuff, and they had their right to great Thanksgiving. Well, a few years later, the Pilgrims went to war with the Pequods and engaged in active genocide, wiped them out, took their land. If you ever get up to New England and are passing between Connecticut and Rhode Island, you've got to go to the, I can't remember the name of the casino that the Indians own, right? It might be Foxford. What is it? Yeah, I can't remember that.
There's something on Shinnecock, but that's New York.
It's right on the border of Rhode Island and Connecticut. And the casino is great, but they use the money from the casino to create a museum of Native American history, and it's unlike any museum you'll ever go to, because it tells the story from the Native American side, and you'll learn all about all the slaughters and the genocide that took place. And William Penn's son, Thomas Penn, dispossessed the Lenape of all their land in the Lehigh Valley in something called the Walking Purchase.
Yeah.
Any of you ever heard of that? What do you know about
It's
that?
documented at the Mercer Museum. It's really interesting. They said you can have the land if you can walk in, is it a day?
Day and a half, yeah.
Day and a half. But what they did was they picked, you walked, and you walked, and you walked, and you walked, and the Lenape didn't expect that at all.
No, they picked the three fastest
Yeah,
runners
well,
they
whatever.
could find to run for a day and a half, rather than walk and smoke a pipe and eat lunch, stuff like that. So it turned out to be like 4 or 5 times the amount of land
They expected.
that they expected. So because of that, the Lenape became known as the Delaware Indians. When the French and Indian War came around, we tried to get them on our side, and they said, you screwed us on the Quakers screwed us on the Delaware, on the Walking Purchase, so we're fighting with the French. You can see that at the Museum of the American Revolution. If you haven't been there yet, you'll see the whole thing about the Delaware. We used to be there in Africa. So anyway, that's the start of our tour. You now know that it was the Quakers who, when the English got control of the Delaware Valley. So, the Dutch sort of passed this island by, make their first fort and trading post at Burlington Island, and then they had one just down here near Gloucester called Fort Nassau. That was their last fort. And the Swedes never really settled here. They came up as far as Philadelphia. We know that they traded on the island, but they never settled here. And so it was the English Quakers and Elizabeth Kinsey who bought the island. She married Thomas Fairman, who witnessed this deed, by the way. He was 2 years before he got married. He was one of the witnesses on the deed. He married her. And it was Thomas Fairman, I have to tell you, who William Penn's cousin, who was the first acting governor of Pennsylvania, was Thomas Fairman, who surveyed the Delaware River and who, at the governor's request, located where the city of Philadelphia would be built. So the owner of Fetty's Island not only housed William Penn when he came here, he also surveyed and decided that where the Philadelphians would be located was the best place along the river to be built, and he negotiated the land transaction that allowed Penn to build the city there with a Swedish family called the Swansons, and he traded land further up the Schuylkill River in exchange for the site of Philadelphia. So a lot of Pennsylvania history associated with the early founders of Fetty's Island. Any questions before we move on? I'm sorry it took so long in the initial stage here, but it's important to get grounded in how we got where we are. Yeah.